Coming up next, Book TV presents Afterwards, an hour-long program where we invite guest hosts to interview authors. This week, William Cohan, author of The Last Tycoons, discusses his new book, House of Cards, a tale of hubris and wretched excess on Wall Street. Mr. Cohan details the rise and fall of Bear Stearns and focuses on the choices executives made that ultimately led to the government-forced merger with J.P. Morgan. Mr. Cohan discusses his book with Deborah Solomon, finance reporter for the Wall Street Journal.
In House of Cards, you paint a picture of a company that took on huge amounts of leverage, was run by a dysfunctional and sometimes sparring family of executives who seemed blind almost to the risks that they were taking. How did Bear get it so wrong?
Well, I mean, you have to, I think, take it apart a little bit and say, did Warren Spector not understand what was going on? He was the man who ran the fixed income business, which, as you know, generated about 90% of the revenues of the firm. I think that he probably understood exactly the risks that they were taking, the leverage that the firm took on. And then there was the executive committee of 4 other people, and including Warren Spector, Jimmy Kane, Ace Greenberg, Alan Schwartz, and Sam Molinaro, the CFO. Now, Jimmy told me, and he was the CEO from 1993 to 2008, that he was not good enough, as he said, not smart enough or not clever enough, not insightful enough to realize the amount of risks that the firm was taking on, and he didn't really understand these securities, which is, a nice admission of sorts, and I think I appreciated that when he said it. And I believe that he believes it, but on the other hand, I find it absolutely unbelievable that Bear would have in place a CEO paying him $30, $40 million a year and have him not understand the risks that the firm was taking on and the kinds of securities that the firm was taking on. And maybe the blame for that belongs with the board of directors, who should have been a little more aggressive about putting in place a CEO who did understand those things.
There seemed to be warning signs, though. I mean, Bear Stearns had these hedge funds that imploded. Why did nobody sort of heed those warning signs, or were there things they could have realized from that implosion that would have maybe avoided the fate that they ultimately faced?
All right, it's a very good question, because the hedge funds, their decisions regarding the hedge funds, I think, really put them in an additionally precarious position. So about in the spring of 2007, the hedge funds had been rolling along. They had about 40 months in a row of positive returns on the hedge funds, and everybody was lauding Ralph Cioffi and Matthew Tanine, the 2 hedge fund managers, as heroes. And then in the spring of 2007, the marks started to come down on the value of the securities in the funds. And at one point in April of 2007, they reported that the NAV had actually, the net asset value of the funds, had fallen about 6% for that month, which is not good by any stretch of the imagination, and was basically one of the first or second times that the fund had lost value in a month. But a week later, Goldman Sachs came back with revised marks, their marks about the fund, about the value of the securities in the fund. And instead of being at 99, 98, 97, Goldman's marks were at 50 cents on the dollar, which they rechecked again as is required by the SEC. Goldman stood by their marks, and the rest of the market stood by their marks. So then they had to average the marks together. They ended up having to reissue their NAV to investors, and it was down 19.6%. So it went down from minus 6% to minus close to 20%. And that was, as one Bear Stearns executive told me, game, set, match for the funds. Now, the Bear then made the fateful decision later on in June to essentially replace the overnight lenders to the fund, the so-called repo lenders to the fund, with their own financing from Bear Stearns. At that point, Bear Stearns had only a $45 million equity investment in the funds. A lot of money for sure, but not the end of the world for Bear Stearns. They then decided, against Jimmy Kane's wishes, to be fair to him, to replace the repo lenders, take on $1.5 billion worth of overnight lending or short-term lending to the fund. And of course that became a very fateful decision within a month when they decided to liquidate the funds. They took all that collateral that was secured, the loans that secured, and that collateral became worthless as well, and that's what resulted in the big loss that Bear Stearns had in the fourth quarter of 2007, which was the first time the firm had a loss in its 84-year history.
To step back for a minute, unfortunately the problems that befell Bear Stearns have become very common in the financial sector. We've seen Lehman Brothers file for bankruptcy, Bank of America and Citigroup need government bailouts. What happened here? What were these companies betting on? It was the real estate market. It sort of explained for people watching how it went from being something of a boom to something of a bust. Was it the same thing that's caused people at home to see their property values decline? They make risky bets at Bear, just like people did, buying houses they couldn't afford.
Yes, Deborah, it's actually an element of that as well. I mean, I think you have to probably go back to a policy decision made by the Clinton administration to encourage home ownership, which is, part of the American dream, right? So the Clinton administration decided that was a good thing, and basically home ownership in this country had averaged around 62% of households owned their own homes. The Clinton administration, got on the bandwagon and started trumpeting that people should increase their home ownership. So that increased over time to about 67%, and the Bush administration jumped on that bandwagon too. So it was this continuum of home ownership. Well, that delta, that difference of about 5 percentage points, was probably around 3 million new homeowners, some of whom, could afford to get a mortgage to buy their home, some of whom could not but got the mortgage anyway because of fraudulent behavior in the mortgage lending business. And this volume, this huge volume of new mortgages and new home ownership was further exacerbated by the increasing rise in home prices, causing people to refinance repeatedly, take equity out, increase their overall leverage on their home. And this became like the most perfect product in the world. Anybody who ever touched it apparently made money on it. So mortgages were this boon for the economy, and you combine that with the low interest rate environment that we were in after 9/11, and Wall Street took to this. They'd basically since the 80s had been securitizing loans, but this huge new volume of mortgage financing resulted in a huge new volume of asset-backed, mortgage-backed securities. Wall Street took to this with a passion. Bear Stearns, Lehman, Merrill, all of them really, except for the smaller boutiques. And they securitized these things, they packaged them up, they sold them off to hungry investors all over the world who were hungry for yield, higher interest rates, higher yielding investments. And of course, these had been rated in large part AAA by the rating agencies, which was another big problem here. And as these securities got sent all over the world, and Wall Street was making huge fees for underwriting these, it was a great, as Chuck Prince said, you dance while the music is playing. The music started to stop. People started warning about it. Paul Volcker warned about it in February of 2005 at a speech at Stanford, and Meredith Whitney warned about it at the end of 2005 in her writings, that basically we were in an asset bubble in the mortgage area, in the housing area, and as people found that they had over-leveraged themselves, couldn't pay the mortgages, could never have paid them in the first place, the performance of these mortgage-backed securities started to decline. And, Wall Street got stuck with huge inventories of this product on their balance sheet, and, les jeux sont faits.
But within Bear, there was one of the gentlemen you have in your book throughout is Paul Friedman. He seemed to sound some alarm bells at Bear that they needed to raise capital, get out of some of these positions. Why didn't anyone listen?
Well, not only Paul, but also Robert Upton as well, who was the treasurer of the firm. I think were quite outspoken along the way about saying, we've ratcheted up the leverage too much. We shouldn't be using one of Bob Upton's continuous comments was we're using the cash balances of our hedge fund clients, and we're taking that money and using it elsewhere in the firm. That's called rehypothecating, which is a fancy way of saying, using somebody else's money to go invest somewhere else. And he kept saying, we shouldn't do this, we should raise capital. And he's the one who was, meeting with the rating agencies constantly and getting, the vibe that, Bear Stearns was running too risky a business.